It was just another regular day when my phone rang, but the voice on the other end of the line turned everything upside down. The calm, impersonal tone of the hospital staff contrasted with the shock that gripped me as soon as I heard the words, "We found your wife at her lover's house. There's been an incident, and she's in a coma." I remember the silence that followed. My heart raced as I tried to process the information. I had known something was off for a while. Her distant behavior, late nights, secretive phone calls. But hearing about an incident during one of their love games, shattered me. I rushed to the hospital, my mind swirling with thoughts I couldn't control. The images in my head were unbearable. But nothing prepared me for what I saw when I arrived. There she was, lying unconscious, attached to machines, her body pale and fragile. But what I couldn't forget was the sickening realization that her injuries were a result of what I could only call betrayal. Not just emotional, but physical. She had let another man into our most intimate space, and now I was faced with the consequences of that reckless choice. As I stood there, looking at her, a feeling of numbness washed over me. The anger I had been suppressing for months finally bubbled to the surface. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now she was lying here, unable to face the consequences. But I wasn't here to feel sorry for her. I turned to leave, my decision already made. I knew what I had to do. I cut her off financially, leaving her with nothing. No more support, no more assistance. She had made her choice. Now, she would have to face the reality of her actions alone. I left the hospital without looking back. There was nothing more I could do for her. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it, alone. As the days passed, the initial shock began to fade. But what didn't fade was the burning anger that simmered inside me. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and far deeper than anything I had imagined. How could she do this to me? To us? My thoughts kept returning to the bed, our bed, the place that should have been sacred, where we once shared our dreams, fears, and intimate moments. She had defiled it with another man. The thought made my stomach churn. But more than the disgust, I felt a deep sense of loss. The woman I thought I knew had shattered everything I believed in. She wasn't the person I had loved and trusted for so many years. I spent hours pacing my house, trying to process the betrayal. I had to know more. What had really happened? Who was this man? How long had she been seeing him? I needed answers. But not just from her. No, I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I turned to the one place where the truth might be hidden. The messages, the calls, the clues she had left behind. I dug through her things. It wasn't something I had ever done before. Snooping through her personal stuff. But in that moment, I felt I had every right to. I found messages on her phone, exchanges that made my blood boil. There were times she spoke about our life, our family, as if it didn't even matter to her. There were pictures, intimate, private moments with him, scattered across the screen. And then there was the last message she sent him just a few hours before the incident. "I'm thinking of you. Can't wait for tonight. You'll make everything better." My stomach twisted. I couldn't take it anymore. The images flooded my mind, and I knew I had been living a lie for so long. All those times I thought she was out working late, or having a quiet night, in with friends. It was all a cover for what had really been going on behind my back. She had betrayed not just me, but the vows we had taken, the life we had built. But I couldn't let this go unanswered. The anger inside me was replaced with something darker, a desire for retribution, for justice. I would make her face the consequences, but not just her. Her lover, too, would pay. I didn't care how long it took. I wasn't going to let this slide. After days of relentless thinking, I had made up my mind. This wasn't going to be some impulsive, emotional reaction. I wasn't going to give her or him the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. I would act, but with precision and clarity. I began to gather information. Her lover. Who was he? How long had he been in the picture? I dug deeper, asking around, using what little I knew about him. His name was David. He was her co-worker, a guy she always talked about in passing. I never thought much of him. But now, every small detail about him felt like a key piece of the puzzle. I found out where he lived, what kind of car he drove, and the places he frequented. Nothing was left to chance. The pieces fell into place one by one. I wasn't going to confront him recklessly, though. I knew that would only escalate things, and I wasn't in the mood for a shouting match or a messy altercation. No, my revenge was going to be quieter, more calculated. I needed to ensure she wouldn't expect it. I stayed distant, cold, and unbothered whenever she tried to contact me. I even let her call a few times, her voice full of regret and pleading, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of answering. I knew she was scared. She knew I was capable of something. The truth was, she didn't know what I was planning, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I started keeping track of her movements. She had returned home after the incident, still in a coma for a while, but now she was awake. The doctor said she would make a full recovery, but mentally, I could tell she was broken. The guilt was written all over her face when she tried to apologize, but I didn't let her words affect me. I had no sympathy for her. She didn't know it yet, but I was going to make her regret every single choice she had made, every lie she had told. And David, her lover, he was going to pay for being the catalyst of this disaster. The pieces were in motion. I had made my plans, and now I just needed the right moment. Days passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the incident that had almost cost her life. She lay in bed, weak, recovering physically, but I knew that wouldn't change the betrayal. My mind kept racing, trying to piece together the fragments of what had happened during the night at David's place. The doctors had their own version of events, and it wasn't one I had expected. I had been told it was an accident during one of their love games, but the more I dug, the more I realized it was far worse than I thought. The report from the hospital was chilling. It wasn't just David who had been involved. The doctors confirmed that my wife had been drugged, something I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams. According to the medical examination, traces of sedatives were found in her system. She had been given something in her coffee, which made her unconscious. And that wasn't all. David hadn't acted alone. The doctor's report clearly stated that there had been multiple individuals involved in what happened to her. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. David hadn't just hurt her. He had brought others into this sickening betrayal. There were 3 or 4 men, all friends of David, who had participated in this twisted act. They fuck her from her front very badly. Even the bed sheet got wet, with her bleeding. They had all taken part in the assault. It wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a coordinated attack, a deliberate violation. The thought that she had been drugged, manipulated, and subjected to something so monstrous by the very people she had trusted was more than I could bear. I spent hours digging for more details, following every lead I could find. What I uncovered was enough to freeze my blood. I learned that when she'd gone to David's house that night, everything had been planned. He had spiked her coffee with a sedative, rendering her unable to resist, leaving her at the mercy of him and his friends. The realization that my wife had allowed herself to be placed in such a position made my stomach churn. She had betrayed me, and now she had been violated in ways I couldn't even begin to describe. My anger grew, but there was something else, a cold, calculating rage that took hold of me. This wasn't just a matter of infidelity. This was something far more insidious. They had crossed a line that could never be erased. And now I was going to make sure they paid for it. I spent the next few days consumed by a singular thought: retribution. This wasn't just about punishing her for the affair. This was personal. It was about restoring my dignity, about making sure that the people who had caused this pain felt every ounce of what I was feeling. I had spent so much time trying to hold everything together, trying to be the good husband, the supportive partner. But now I realized that my kindness had been taken for granted. I wasn't going to let her walk away unscathed. No, I needed her to feel the weight of her actions. And not just her, but David and his friends too. I had been wronged in the most unforgivable way, and the time for forgiveness was over. The first step was to confront David, but not directly. That would have been too obvious. I needed to catch him off guard, to make sure he felt the full brunt of my anger, without even realizing what was coming. I had found out where he worked. He was an insurance agent, and so I decided to hit him where it would hurt most: his career. I made a few discreet phone calls to some of his colleagues, subtly feeding them a story about his inappropriate behavior at work. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't need to. The seed of doubt was all I needed to plant. The rumors started to spread, and soon enough, HR was called in for a confidential investigation. David's life, which had once seemed so stable and perfect, was beginning to unravel. Next, I turned to his friends. I didn't need them to know what I was doing, but I knew I could cause enough damage by making them aware of what had transpired. I reached out to a few of their wives, anonymously, of course, and told them the details of what had happened that night. The image of their husbands participating in such a horrific act, in violation of my wife, was enough to shatter their relationships. Within days, the tension among them was palpable. Calls were made, arguments erupted, and their once untouchable friendship began to fall apart. Meanwhile, my wife was left in the dark. She had no idea what was coming, and I wasn't going to let her in on it until the very last moment. Her calls were left unanswered. I let her stew in her guilt, her confusion, as she tried to piece together the silence. It was exactly what she deserved. Unanswered questions, a void where my support and care had once been. But the final move, the one that would bring everything crashing down, was reserved for the moment I would confront her. I wasn't going to do it until I had ensured that David and his friends had been sufficiently shaken. I wanted to see them squirm before I made my final move. And that moment was drawing closer. The day had finally arrived. Everything had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. I had been biding my time, watching as David's life crumbled around him, and his friends' relationships soured. But none of that mattered now. The real prize was sitting in front of me. My wife, the woman I had once loved and trusted, who had betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined. I walked into our house, the place that used to feel like home, but now felt like a cold, lifeless shell. She was sitting there, looking frail, exhausted, her eyes darting nervously when she saw me. She was trying to play the part of the remorseful wife, the one who had suffered enough and was ready to beg for forgiveness. Her voice was shaky as she began, but I cut her off before she could say a word. "You don't get to speak yet," I said, my voice low and controlled. "You've had plenty of chance to explain yourself. But today, you don't get that luxury." Her face went pale as the words sank in. She could feel the weight of my anger, the simmering rage that I had kept bottled up for so long. I had kept quiet for far too long, and now it was time to let everything out. "I know what happened, Sarah," I continued, my eyes locking with hers. "I know exactly what you did with David, and I know about the others. You think I didn't notice? You thought I would never find out? You were wrong. It's over." She shook her head, her hands trembling. No, you don't understand. It wasn't like that." But I wasn't listening. Her words meant nothing now. All the years we spent together, all the trust I placed in her, it was gone. In that moment, I felt no sympathy, no compassion, just cold, unrelenting fury. "I don't need to hear your excuses," I snapped, my voice rising. "I know about the drugs, the others. I know everything." Her eyes widened in horror, her lips parted, but no words came out. She couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. "You were drugged. You were taken advantage of," I continued, each word like a dagger. "But don't fool yourself. This was no accident. You allowed it. You let it happen. You invited them into our home and into your bed." She collapsed into the chair, sobbing uncontrollably now. But it was too late. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. My revenge had been set in motion, and now I was going to make sure she understood the cost of her actions. I stood up and walked to the door, turning to her one last time. "You'll never see me again, Sarah. You're not worth it. You'll never have me again. You and David, you two deserve each other. But remember this, I'm done." And with that, I walked out, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her own making. The days that followed were filled with silence. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I didn't have to question every move my wife made, didn't have to wonder if I was being lied to or deceived. I had learned the truth, and it was a truth that had shattered my world into pieces. But now, there was nothing left to do but walk away. I took the time to rebuild myself, piece by piece. The pain of what I had been through was still there, lurking in the background, but I no longer had to bear it alone. I had taken control of my life, my decisions, and my future, and I was no longer a victim. I was free. Meanwhile, Sarah, my ex-wife, was left to pick up the pieces of her life. She tried to reach out, sending me countless messages and voicemails, apologizing, begging for forgiveness, but I had no sympathy left to give. What had been shattered could never be repaired. The damage was irreparable. David was nowhere to be found, and her friends who once supported her had turned their backs, leaving her isolated and alone. The divorce was finalized swiftly. The assets I had built over the years were protected, and I walked away with a sense of peace. I was no longer tied to someone who had treated me as less than, who had turned our marriage into a joke. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. I had found my strength, my resolve, and now I was going to live my life for me. But the true victory wasn't in the divorce or the revenge. It was in the realization that I had reclaimed my dignity. I had not been the one who was weak. She had. And I had learned to let go, to move on, knowing that I was better than the lies she had told, better than the betrayal she had caused. As for her, she would spend the rest of her life reflecting on what she had lost. But I wasn't going to wait around for that. I had my own future to build, my own happiness to pursue, and I was going to do it, with or without her.